I want to point to something here, by the way, that is completely absent from the media narratives, including, understandably, from the ways in which the Republicans are talking about the legacy of Charlie Kirk. Was Charlie Kirk a noteworthy figure on college campuses? The answer to that question is yes. Was Charlie Kirk a beloved figure on college campuses? The answer to that is no. Turns out there were actually, there was a poll that was conducted on the matter, okay? And I'm wrong. I was wrong about this too, because I thought he had more motion. Like I thought he had more positive. Like I thought he had a more positive approval rating amongst like the Gen Z youth. And it's actually even worse than I thought, okay? Charlie Kirk was a beloved figure, once again, always for boomers, and was not known at all by Zoomers in general, by the younger generations. I thought TikTok had actually greatly inflated his approval ratings amongst the youth as well. It turns out there was a post-mortem poll that was conducted. I think it was a YouGov poll. What's interesting to me about this is that it turns out Gen Z did recognize Charlie Kirk. However, Gen Z did not like Charlie Kirk at all. You know, bit of a my bad on this, for sure. I didn't think that I thought he was like a, polarizing figure or whatever. But it turns out he was just not liked at all by the youth. Now, of course, they're still presenting him as this like whisperer, but it turns out he was still very much, no, it wasn't the Washington Free Beacon one. It still turns out he was very much like Olivia Giuliana for the Republican Party. Old people thought that young people liked him, and therefore, old people thought that young people liked him, but it turns out young people didn't like him that much. And it was just mostly old people that liked him. I'm going to try to find the poll real quick and show it to you. And it's like not even remotely mentioned in any of the ways in which people are reflecting on his legacy. It's the Harvard Kennedy poll. Is that the one? I thought it was YouGov. No, I don't think it's the Harvard. I don't think it's the Harvard one. There's another one that came out. Oh, the Economist YouGov poll. Thank you. That's the one. Here it is. Favorability of Charlie Kirk. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of Charlie Kirk? Okay, amongst all adult citizens. When you look at the 18 to 29, 18 to 30, the very favorable rating for Charlie Kirk was at 16%. Somewhat favorable was at 8%. Neither favorable or unfavorable was 24%. But very unfavorable was at 35%. So he had double the amount of very unfavorable amongst the 18 to 30 polled. It turns out that he actually he was not reflected positively upon the younger audiences at all. And it was actually the older populations that had a very favorable approval of Charlie Kirk from 45 onward, and especially the highest at 65 plus. Charlie Kirk was always very favorable among older people because older people thought that he was actually reaching the youth and convincing them and changing their minds. And that's precisely the way that he has been covered in the media as well. But it turns out that's not the case at all. In spite of the astroturfing that you're seeing, in spite of the media push that you're seeing, people knew who he was, but he was not all that different from Harry Hasan or an Olivia Giuliana style figure, but further right. But didn't he lose popularity alongside Trump since Trump took office? That could be part of the reason as well. Certainly. That could be part of the reason as well, but you wouldn't see this much of a major shift if he was still the Gen Z whisperer. So it turns out he was still basically the same figure that I knew him as throughout his entire career. Someone who was telling the olds in the party what they wanted to hear and making it seem as though you don't care about the facts. Clip farm monkey. Come on, man, get better. Your blood is on that rifle. Don't be sheep, kids. Go get a new source. Dog, I'm literally looking at a poll that directly contradicts the mainstream narrative. I like that you cried about you don't care about the facts and then tried to tie me back to this assassination like a lunatic. Wake up, sheeple. Yeah, here it is. New poll for Puck News. A new poll of college students from Generation Lab finds that Charlie Kirk was almost universally famous on campuses, but he was not popular, with 70% of students saying they disagree with Kirk's views. Okay? That's the other poll that I wanted to look at. Yeah, I was glancing at a YouGov poll, and what stood out to me is that Kirk was most popular among boomers and mostly unpopular among young people. But the way that people are deifying him, they are creating a false narrative that he was actually super, super popular and his ideas were super popular, and he was actually doing the most to continue presenting this the incredibly popular Trump narrative to a younger audience and convincing them. I wasn't so certain on that narrative regardless. As I told you, there were systemic factors at play, and I presented approval ratings amongst Gen Z for Donald Trump in general and how much they swung back in the opposite direction. So clearly that wasn't the case anyway. Having said that, however, I didn't know that he was actually this unpopular amongst college campus, amongst the youth. But this also kind of shows me why TikTok has been so aggro, like a lot more aggro than even someone like myself, in basically making jokes about Charlie Kirk. Like, they were very familiar with Charlie Kirk, a lot more familiar than the rest of the normies are, a lot more familiar than like older populations are. Older populations just knew Charlie Kirk as like a guy, a conservative who went and duked on SJWs on college campuses. But it turns out the youth knew about him a lot better, knew his positions a lot better, and actually did not like his positions at all. That's part of the reason why perhaps the only people that you hear talking about how like you've awakened a demon in us, and oh, now you're gonna really get it. Milo Yiannopoulos is coming back from retirement. They're all like 40 plus. It's all like Gen Xers and older millennials who were already right wing. What the do you mean? Everywhere he goes, people organize a protest against him. They literally have to beg colleges to let him in. We used to make fun of them when they showed up. Compare his shit with the encampments and you will know just how unpopular these guys were. No, for sure. But a figure like this, if they were correct, if the current narrative was correct, this wouldn't, the polls would reflect it. Like, they wouldn't say 70% of students saying they disagree with Kirk's views. That's a crazy number. Okay? It would at least be like 50-50 or something. Okay? Do you understand what I mean? Like, if Charlie Kirk was at the very least like a polarizing figure, then his approval ratings would be a lot higher for college age students. And this poll specifically polled college students. I want to see if I can find this poll. Does anyone know where this is? And we can take a look at it. He didn't go to college to debate people who agree with him. No, I know. I know that. Yeah. Generation Lab, Q1, have you heard of Charlie Kirk? 94% of those polled said yes. But obviously this is after his death as well. This is going to be boosted for sure. How often have you watched or listened to Charlie Kirk's content in the past year? 36% say never. 33% say once or twice. This is all TikTok. 21% say a few times a month. 7% say a few times per week. So now you're getting into fan territory. Daily or almost daily, 2%. To what extent do you agree with Charlie Kirk's views? 10% say strongly agree. 20% say somewhat agree. 17% say somewhat disagree. 53% say strongly disagree. This is just college students being polled on this. 4% say definitely justified, the murder of Charlie Kirk. 11% say probably justified. 22% say probably not justified, and 63% say definitely not justified, which is understandable. Do you think it is ever okay to physically harm someone because of their political beliefs? 1% say yes, it is okay in many cases. Jesus Christ, who the says that? 13% say yes, it is okay in some cases, and 86% say no, it is never okay. Again, understandable. Okay, so that all of that makes sense. Remember, these are our college students being polled on this, and ironically enough, a big part of my debates with Charlie Kirk actually featured the ways in which mainstream media covered college campus madness at the time versus what polls showed. One thing that I always brought up to Charlie Kirk at Politicon, both in the first debate that we had and in the second debate that we had as well, was that people's attitudes about college campus free speech mania actually was not broadly reflected by college campus attendees at all. When college students were polled on free speech and whether people should be able to hear opinions that they disagree with, they overwhelmingly agreed with that. It was actually older people, both college educated and not, that felt as though there was a real free speech issue on college campuses. I find that very interesting because most of the people that cover this stuff are way past their prime, way past their college age, and therefore they have a very different attitude, and they just simply avoid these sorts of polls. And therefore you can astroturf this complete false narrative that he was the Gen Z whisperer across the board. The news story behind the poll is right here from Puck News. Here it is. What college students really think of Kirk. New data from Generation Lab undercuts Trump's myth-making about his murdered ally, who was unquestionably a savvy organizer, even if he wasn't at all popular on campuses he loved to visit. Charlie Kirk was certainly famous in politics on campuses in the halls of Donald Trump's White House. But I imagine that for plenty of sports fans attending Major League Baseball games or NFL games over the weekend, it must have been a tad confusing to peer up from the stands to see Kirk's square jaw face on stadium jumbotrons. A bunch of teams from the New York Yankees to the Dallas Cowboys to the LSU Tigers honored Kirk this way. Are you saying old people are irrelevant? Yes, that's what I'm saying. That's your takeaway from this? No, what I'm simply stating is that the way that Charlie Kirk is being deified currently is false, because the way that they're presenting him as this Gen Z whisperer who converted so many young people because they agreed with him, because he was doing spirited debate. Every aspect of this is a falsehood. I've already talked about this. He did not invent the change my mind concept at all. Ben Shapiro was doing it. Steven Crowder was doing it before him, but he obviously perfected it because he had the pre-existing structure, because he was already on all these college campuses with Turning Point USA. But if we are talking about the efficacy of the social justice warrior-owned clip compilations that came from these campus debates, if we're talking about the efficacy of changing people's minds, then clearly it actually did not swing a lot of people at all, okay? For the most part, it seems like the people that were watching those videos and agreeing with those videos were older people. The college-aged Gen Z students that were actually watching those videos or even encountering Charlie Kirk's videos on their TikTok timeline clearly did not actually agree with Charlie Kirk. This is evidence to prove that the popular narrative surrounding Charlie Kirk's impact in American politics is based around a falsehood. Conservative podcasts are seemingly not all that popular with the Gen Z. And I know this from YouTube, okay? I know this from YouTube analytics as well. I've had conversations with YouTube in the past where they've told me that out of all of the political commentators out there, all the way from, the liberals to the leftists to right-wingers as well, I have the youngest audience. And this always struck me as not so surprising, but, it just didn't make sense. It turns out that there's a lot of older people that actually consume political content on YouTube. And if the person that is doing the commentary is young, a lot of older people assume that young people are watching. But it turns out that's not the case. Is it still the case in 2025? I don't know what the latest numbers look like, obviously, but that was the case in 2024. Several conservative podcasts, including those hosted by Charlie Kirk, Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, and Dave Portnoy, have built significant audience among Gen Z Americans, particularly those who voted for President Donald Trump in last year's election, according to a new survey. The Axios Generation Lab polls findings suggest that partisan media consumption trends are firmly established among young adults, with many aligning their podcast choices with their political preferences. The Axios Generation Lab poll, conducted from February 21st to 28 among a representative sample of 972 18 to 34-year-olds nationwide, found that in the past month, 34% of Trump voters in this group had listened to Barstool Sports podcast, making Trump-supported Portnoy's show the most popular among young people who voted for the president. That figure dropped to just 9% among those who voted for former Vice President Kamala Harris. Other conservative-leaning podcasts also showed a strong skew towards Trump voters. Roughly 27% said they listened to the Joe Rogan Experience monthly, 19% of the Charlie Kirk Show, and 18% of the Ben Shapiro Show. Among Harris supporters, only 3% said they listened to the Kirk or Shapiro, and just 6% tuned into Joe Rogan's show monthly. The poll's margin of error, plus or minus, is 3.1 percentage points. Kirk's rapid rise in conservative media, he now holds the number one spot among conservative podcasts, according to Salem Media, underscores the resonance with young, right-leaning Americans. While some podcasts like The Daily, TED Talks Daily, Caller Daddy drew more balanced audiences, Axios noted that entertainment and leisure preferences were also split along party lines. Harris supporters, for example, were more likely to attend concerts, while Trump supporters leaned into sports. Not necessarily. The people who support TPUSA think that without Kirk's efforts, the positive reaction to conservatism among young youth would be something like 20%. With Kirk's, having a 30% positive response would be an improvement. So I already tackled this argument before that Kirk's impact was negligible on this issue, and it was more of a response to systemic factors. Okay? I am of the mindset that it is very difficult for one singular media figure or a number of different media figures to actually greatly change the minds of many people, as opposed to systemic factors at play. Okay? Systemic factors such as discontent with the administration, attributing liberalism and the Democratic Party to the lockdowns that they experienced during COVID, even though it happened under Trump as well. Okay, Biden's age, the fact that they feel as though they're not going to be able to ever buy a house or retire at a reasonable age. These are all the many reasons why a lot of young people did not with the party, the Democratic Party. And because they were so young to remember, because they were too young to remember fully what the Trump administration looked like, what the first Trump term looked like, they were more susceptible to the narrative, as people were in 2016 when Trump was a relatively new figure in the political scene, that he would potentially represent a radical change in a positive direction. If you look at broader trend lines amongst the Gen Z, Donald Trump did make inferences. Donald Trump did make big gains in Gen Z votes. This is true. Having said that, however, Gen Z swung wildly against Donald Trump in the last 6 or 7 or 8 months. If Charlie Kirk was this smooth operator that was able to maintain brand loyalty to the Republican Party single-handedly, then that swing would not have taken place. I brought this up on numerous occasions. What I'm saying now with this information is that he was even actually less successful in changing the minds of the youth than even I previously thought. That was my point. Okay? This is one of the latest YouGov economist polls that came out, polling 1,567 U.S. adult citizens. Okay? And the 18 to 29 numbers reflect a devastating reality. Would you say things in this country today are generally headed in the right direction, off on the wrong track, or not sure? Right direction for 18 to 29 is at 19%. Off on the wrong track is 71%. For 30 to 44, it's also still relatively high. It's pretty high for every age group. This YouGov poll also looks at Charlie Kirk too, because this is in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Concerns about left-wing extremism. Very concerned at 18 to 29 is at 36%. Somewhat concerned is at 20%. Not very concerned is at 13%. Not at all concerned is at 11%. Not sure is at 20% for 18 to 29. But when you get to the older populations, very concerned is at 44% and very concerned is at 46%. Now, that's still pretty high, even for the youth, for the record, which means that the notion of left-wing extremism being a major problem, the narrative that the administration has presented, a false narrative, for the record, that the administration has presented, that the mainstream media has actually refused to offer clarity on, to refuse to offer any sort of counter messaging on, has set. Having said that, amongst the youth, when you look at how concerned they are with right-wing extremism, amongst the youth, it goes up a little bit higher, 39%. Okay? 36% for 30 to 44 as opposed to 34%, marginally higher. And then for people over the age of 45 all the way to 65 plus, it's either for 45 to 64 Gen X, it actually goes down, generation-led, everybody. And for 65 plus, it remains the same. Overall, who do you think is more responsible for political violence in the U.S. is committed by people on the left or right? Mostly on the left, 18 to 29 says 28%. Mostly by the right, they say 32%. By both equally, 27%. Not sure, 13%. 65 plus says mostly on the left. More people, when you go up to 45 plus, think it's political violence is happening mostly on the left as opposed to happening mostly on the right. Insane. This is the opposite of reality, for the record. Just think about that. This means that a large chunk of 45-year-olds and people older than the age of 45 believe in this false narrative. Congratulations to not just Fox News for this, but also to all of the liberal media platforms as well, all the legacy media that has presented this false reality and refused to actually show the truth. Because remember, we're talking about something that is not even, we're talking about something that is just objectively false. There is nonpartisan studies that have been conducted on this. There are studies that have been conducted by the Department of Justice on this, which is now deleted, obviously, that show that this is just a falsehood. Now we get to the familiarity with Charlie Kirk. 18 to 29 say very familiar, and 30 to 44, 25% say very familiar. 36% for 18 to 29 say somewhat familiar with Charlie Kirk. Okay, so that's 63% either very familiar or somewhat familiar with Charlie Kirk. Had heard of him but don't know anything, but didn't know anything, 19%. Never heard of him, 18%. But when you look at the favorability of Charlie Kirk, 16% had a very favorable opinion between the ages of 18 to 29. 8% had a somewhat favorable opinion of him. Okay, and that is, once again, September 12th to September 15th. So this is after he was the top news story. So 16% had a favorable, very favorable opinion of him. 8% had a somewhat favorable opinion of Charlie Kirk. So that's 24% that had a somewhat favorable or very favorable opinion of him. Another 24% have no opinion, neither favorable nor unfavorable. And 10% have a somewhat unfavorable, and 35% have a very unfavorable opinion of him. This also goes back to the same poll that we were looking at earlier, the one that actually factored in simply just college students on college campus. This is the entirety of the 18 to 30-year-old population, which includes, of course, non-college students as well as college students. So while they did know who Charlie Kirk was, a lot of people under the age of 30 did not have a favorable opinion of him, with the highest percentage having a very unfavorable opinion of him. Okay, something to consider. And of course, it's the exact opposite when you look at boomers, with 34% having a very favorable opinion of him. The reason why I am mentioning all of this is to make sure that people understand what the truth is, to make a better assessment of his impact, as opposed to the way that people are talking about his impact. It turns out that Charlie Kirk was not the liberal or the right-wing Republican Gen Z whisperer that people presented him as at all. The more people knew him, the more people have heard of him, especially amongst the youth, the less they liked him. For the record, part of the reason why I looked at that was also to show you why there was very clearly a differing opinion.
This past week,
why very clearly there was a differing opinion on the way that mainstream media was covering this versus how TikTok was looking at it. Okay? Because mainstream media did not actually reflect on Charlie Kirk's output whatsoever. But the people who are very familiar with Charlie Kirk's output, young people that saw him on their TikTok timeline, they didn't with it. They didn't with what he had to say. Do you see what I mean? It's weird how religious this is. Yeah. And I also don't think that this hyping up, this deification that's taking place is going to be viewed positively anyway. I don't think so at all. I think this is either a mistake, because they're trying to very clearly create enough anxiety and enough anger surrounding Charlie Kirk's death to punish ideological opposition to the administration. And they're going to, in my opinion, fail. And they're still going to try and do it. They're still going to try and enact this vengeance quest. Okay. Which is going to beef up discontent. People are going to get even more mad about this. They're pushing him as a big movement for the religious Gen Z now that everyone knows his rhetoric. I think the media made a big mistake in terms of not reflecting accurately on his political perspectives. So he probably got a big boost from like Gen X and boomers as well, because they were like, he was a guy who wanted to speak truth to power. He was a guy who simply wanted to, you know, find the truth through spirited debate and discourse. And that's the type of shit that's like catnip for boomers. They love that stuff. They're dumb enough to believe that like the medium and the format of debate is certainly one that is productive and done for that purpose and not for propaganda purposes. But I think a lot of people, especially even the Gen Z that watch debates, recognize that it's just frustrating and it's purely for entertainment. And it's a way to like learn the talking points basically of your side. Not everyone that encounters these sorts of debates are going to immediately be swept away by the opposition's talking points. That's just what I'm seeing here.